Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. It was in September of the year 1811 that a carriage drew up at the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire, from which a little boy jumped out. The carriage had brought him to the ornate hall and treed estate from Warwickshire, where, some 6 months before, he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected from the austere recluse, of whom very little was known, apart from his studies and knowledge of ancient pagan religions. It was a matter of great surprise among Abney's neighbours that he should even know his small cousin, Stephen Elliott, let alone welcome him into his household. The tall, thin Mr. Abney darted out of his study to greet Stephen, rubbing his hands with delight and asking how he was, and several times how old he was. Stephen replied 12 years old next birthday, and Abney was at great pains to make a note of the date, the 11th of September, which was nearly a year hence. After this kindly reception, he asked his butler Parkes to take Stephen to the housekeeper's room for supper, where Mrs. Bunch made him feel completely at home. They became great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been housekeeper at the Hall for some 20 years, and was able to answer many of Stephen's questions, such as who were the people in portraits on the staircase. Stephen's question to her one night was, "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" Mrs. Bunch explained that Master was as kind a soul as she had ever seen. He had taken in a little boy from the street some years back, and a little girl 2 years after she had started. Stephen asked her about them. The little girl Mr. Abney had brought back from a walk one day, and asked the then housekeeper to take care of her. She had told Mrs. Bunch she had no relatives, and had lived with them for 3 weeks. Perhaps she was the child of travellers, for one morning she was out of bed before anyone else, and no track or trace was found of her. Master was very concerned, and had all the ponds dragged. But Mrs. Bunch believed the girl had been taken, as there was singing around the house for an hour the night she went, and Parkes had heard calling in the woods all that afternoon. As for the poor boy, he was a foreigner who called himself Giovanni, and came playing his hurdy-gurdy in the driveway one winter's day. Master asked him all about himself, where were his relatives and how old he was, but despite all the kindness shown, he was also off one fine morning like the girl. He never even took his hurdy-gurdy, which still lay on the shelf. That night Stephen had a curious dream. There was an old disused bathroom at the end of his passage, which was kept locked. You could look in through the door's window and see its lead-lined bath. Stephen dreamt of looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. The figure was inexpressibly emaciated and pathetic, its thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant moan seemed to come from its lips, and its arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to find himself standing on the cold floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a rare courage, he went to the bathroom door to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. At breakfast the next morning, Mr. Abney was greatly interested in Stephen's dream, and made notes of it in his book. He also warned Stephen that the spring equinox was coming, a critical time for the young, and that he should shut his bedroom window at night. Strangely, the following evening, Mrs. Bunch was mending Stephen's nightgown and complaining about a series of long slits down the left side of the chest. Stephen was entirely ignorant of their origin. They were not there the night before, but remarked that they were the same as long scratches on the outside of his bedroom door. Mrs. Bunch was shocked to see them and advised him to turn the key of his door when he goes to bed. Even stranger was Park's fear of going into the wine cellar at night because of the voices he could hear in there. It was now March 24th of 1812, and after luncheon that day, Mr. Abney asked Stephen if he could come to his room at 11 o'clock that night. He would be busy until then, but he wished to show Stephen something connected to his future life, which it was important that he know. He told Stephen not to mention it to Mrs. Bunch or anyone else in the house, and to go to his room at the usual time. Stephen felt excited about sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening and saw a brazier, which he had noticed before, moved out before the fire. An old silver-gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen stood at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the distant moonlit woods. From time to time, strange cries of lost and despairing wanderers sounded, perhaps the notes of owls or water birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. They seemed to come nearer, skirting the water, and then floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased, and just as Stephen moved to shut the window, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravelled terrace. The figures of a boy and a girl standing side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl reminded him of his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear, whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart. The boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace, of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands through the fearfully long nails as he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, while Stephen's brain registered the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry grass, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as Stephen was, he took his candle and made his way down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. Urged on by his terrors, he did not take long in getting there, but to effect an entrance was not so easy. He felt sure the door was not locked, for the key was on the outside of it as usual, but his repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged, he was speaking, but why did he try to cry out, and why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study were found certain papers which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important of Abney's notes were as follows. It was a belief very strongly held by the ancients that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns may appear barbaric, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties can be attained. For example, by absorbing the personalities of a number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, become invisible, or assume any form he pleased by the agency of the soul of a boy whose life he had extinguished. Hermes Trismegistus also wrote that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. In the testing of this theory, I have devoted almost 20 years selecting as subjects for my experiment such persons as could conveniently be removed without creating a gap in society. The first was one Phoebe Stanley, from a family of travellers in March 1792. The second, a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli, in March 1805. The final victim, awful word, must be my cousin Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March 24th, 1812. The best method is to remove the heart from the living subject and reduce it to ashes, which are then mingled with red wine. The remains of the first 2 subjects were concealed in a disused bathroom and wine cellar, although some annoyance is experienced from the psychic portion of their beings, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But a man of philosophic temperament like myself will be immune to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. When the experiment is complete and successful, I will be placed beyond the reach of human justice and mortality itself. Mr. Abney had been found in his chair, his head thrown back, and with a facial expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound exposing his heart, but there was no blood on his hands. A long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of a savage wildcat or some other creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of his writings and memory of the apparition he had witnessed led him to a very different conclusion.